Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our book group on Thomas Merton, Seeds of Contemplation. And this week we got to the chapters 17 through to 20. So as you know, we've been looking about 4 chapters each. And so tonight is 17 to 20. Now, I have to say, when I read these chapters, I did struggle. I did struggle a little bit. So if anyone else struggled a little bit, then you're in good company, because I had to read it about 2 or 3 times, but I still didn't quite get there. And then I thought, oh, well, maybe it's my very small brain, and Thomas Merton is much cleverer than me, or maybe I just didn't quite grasp everything he said. So tonight I've had a stab at trying to do an introduction for you, but please don't if you have your own ideas and your own thoughts, and it's like, oh, she's talking rubbish, then please it's fine. I'm not an expert on Merton, as I've said before, because I think it is fair to say, though, that Seeds of Contemplation, it's not an easy read. It's not simple in the sense that it's really kind of clear. It's very reflective, it's very poetic, it's very philosophical and theological, and at times it's actually quite mystical. And then at other times it's really quite challenging. There's a lot of challenge in there from Thomas Merton. So once again, I thought I'd look at a theme. It seems to me to be the best way in to giving an introduction for you. And this week I thought we'd look at the idea of faith, because I think in these 4 chapters he gives us some really interesting takes on faith. And I think the bits that I kind of grasped, I thought were really helpful in understanding what faith is, and expanded a little bit for me how I understand faith and why the faith story is so important. So one of the things that I found really quite liberating was that for Thomas Merton, faith is the beginning of contemplation. Now, in a sense, you could say, well, obvious, you have to have faith if you're going to be contemplative. But I don't think that's what Merton is talking about in the sense of, possessing a faith. I think it's the outlook of faith that is needed to be able to enter into that kind of contemplative life. And that's, for me, that's quite an interesting and sort of a new take on faith in relation to contemplation. He doesn't describe faith as something which you primarily believe about, like a list of propositions. So for him, faith is not about just reciting the creed, but it's actually about an intentional act of trust and openness to mystery, which ultimately leads then to surrender. One of the key insights that Merton has, I think, is that faith is not about something you possess. Invariably, we can say to someone, do you have faith? Now, for Merton, that statement doesn't make any sense, as if faith is something that you pick off you take off the sort of the hanger, and you say, now I'm going to have faith. And often we think that faith is something that we sign up to as a kind of certainty. Faith will give us all the answers, or it will answer some of the questions of life. But Merton actually turns this completely upside down and says that faith is what starts to make us ask the questions. And faith is actually then realizing that there are no answers, there are only questions. It's when we realize that we're not in control of reality and that we can't actually fully grasp God with our intellect. That's what he understands of as faith. So God's not therefore an object that we can know. I'm just letting Nancy in, there we are. Not an object that we can own or master. So it's like, oh yeah, I've got faith now. I have faith and God's my best mate. It's that God is actually much more of a mystery. And it would be interesting to think about, where does Jesus Christ sit in that? Because I know, and I've heard often people say, do you know Jesus? And I often want to say, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? Do I know Jesus? Because if anyone asked me that, I'd sort of have to say, well, actually, I'm not sure I do know Jesus. So there's something going on there, which is a kind of assumption of what faith is, which is about knowledge. And what Merton is saying, faith is not about that. That's his kind of take. But it's about mystery. Now, of course, as soon as I can't start talking like this, and as soon as we mention the word mystery, we begin to hear the language of the mystical tradition, and we hear the language of the apophatic spiritual tradition, the kind of negative. I mean, not negative in the sense of that it's bad or, but negative in the sense that we don't know who God is. We know that Jesus Christ points us the way to God, but the apophatic tradition always says that there is a limit to our understanding. So what's interesting about what Merton is saying about faith is that actually faith is part of that tradition. Actually, it's part of that understanding, that awareness, that knowledge that we live within the mystery of God, who self-reveals himself in the person of Jesus Christ, if you want to put it in those terms. And I suppose I find that very helpful because often I have separated the two, surprisingly enough, that we have faith and we go to church, and then there's this kind of contemplative and mystical sort of side that is a deepening of my relationship with God. But what does that have to do with faith? And actually, he's basically saying, well, all of that, mystical and traditional, and is actually all to do with faith. And faith is the part that leads you towards that. If I don't make any sense, then please don't worry, because I'm not always sure I make sense to myself when I'm reading this. So from last week, we clearly had the understanding that for Merton, and he talks about this true self and false self. And sometimes I wonder about this dichotomy of true self, false self, but this is what Merton presents for us. And that the true self, as we saw last week, is hidden in God, something hidden in God. And faith, therefore, for Merton, is a kind of a movement towards that hidden self, a kind of revealing, sort of taking off of the aspects of the outer skins of the onion to find the hidden self. And faith is what enables us to do that. And it is that kind of trusting without knowing that our deepest identity does not come from where we think it comes from, if you get what I mean. So it doesn't come from what we think about ourselves. It doesn't come from our successes and our failures. It doesn't come from what we necessarily do or how we're good and bad, or whether we say the right thing and we don't say the right thing, or we're trying to be true to ourselves or not true to ourselves, all of that. He said, that's not where our actual identity comes from. Our identity comes when we begin to perceive that we perceive that we actually emerge, we are from being loved into existence by God. That's where identity comes, within the person of God. And so that's why people will say, it's easier to love God, to know God, than it is to know ourselves. Because if we know God, then we'll begin to have an understanding of who we are in the sight of God. So faith, Merton says, calls us to start letting go, to start surrendering our control, our ability that we think that we're in control, that we think we know who we are, we think we know, we got it all sussed. It's about starting to let that go. It's a bit like, have you ever sort of stood on a cliff? No, don't ever do this. But or in your minds stood on a cliff and just sort of been terrified by the fact that actually you might just let go. Well, spiritually, we don't do this, but spiritually, I think what Merton is saying, no, jump off the cliff, and go into the immensity of the person, the mystery, the ocean of God. So I'm using all metaphors there, so please. So it's about surrender and trust. And it's also about, therefore, this is where humility comes in. And humility has been something that's bubbled up every time in in all of the book groups that we've been looking at, for those of you who've sort of stayed the course. And I thought that I really liked the way that Teresa of Avila kind of expressed humility. For me, well, I say that, is it for me? But the way Teresa of Avila expressed humility was really helpful, I think, because she said that humility was about know yourself. And I found that really helpful, because humility, we can often think, well, humility is the person I'd really like to be. Or humility is like that person over there, and I'd really like to be like them. Whereas actually what Teresa Avila says, no, humility is you actually knowing who you are. That, you're just another person who's kind of bumbling along, and you get some things right and you get some things wrong, and how, if you have a kind of understanding of who you are, you begin to have more compassion for other people, because you suddenly recognize that they're actually in the same position. They're just bumbling along too. And sometimes, we help each other, and sometimes we bump into each other. And so I found that quite, so it's about self-knowledge. So if the word humility is difficult for you, I would put in there self-knowledge. The knowledge of when you're really honest about yourself, not when you're wanting to put on a good show, but you're really honest when you know that actually you know what you're really like. And it's that honesty that I think is the humility. So as I said, we've started to move into this kind of apophatic language, and one of the important trends of the apophatic language as a number of you will know, is this idea of darkness. And it's not darkness in the sense of something negative or ignorance or confusion or fear, but it's actually the darkness when you say, I really don't know. I'm, you've actually gone beyond the limits of your understanding. I suppose it's a bit like reading Thomas Merton, actually. So it's a kind of, I really I don't know. I'm in this space, but it's that self-awareness to say, actually, there's nothing anymore that can help me know who God is, to help me know who I am. All the things. I mean, Julian and on the cloud are really good about this. I can do all the prayers and all the meditations and everything, and I can go to all the liturgies and spend hours in times of prayer. But there's a point where you just say, that's not enough. I don't know. And that's the point where we enter into the apophatic. Okay. So Merton says that authentic faith often feels like walking in the dark. So what's amazing is that Merton puts faith right into the center of the apophatic. So it's not like contemplation and the negative talk. It's not a trendy side, which you can have a go at if you want to, or you like, or you're drawn. He says this is something that is fundamental to faith, that it's the same for all people who love God and believe in the person of Jesus Christ, that we cannot see clearly and that we can't necessarily predict the future, and we don't necessarily feel spiritually secure. Now, it may be for us that we feel completely at sea, like where is God gone? But this darkness is not about abandonment, but it's actually the place where trust becomes real, where we begin to rely on God more deeply than we rely on self. So people like John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila would say that for them, the darkness is actually when you are closer to God, because it's like looking at the bright light. I mean, Thomas Merton, not Thomas Merton, I mean, Walter Hilton will say there's a lixum darkness, there's a lightness, darkness. That sort of tautology is trying to get the idea that actually the darkness is because of an overwhelming sense of light, because at last you're beginning to trust and rely on God. It's interesting that the mystical tradition, this place is where the sense of all supports, as I say, begin to fall away. And that's why they call it the dark night of the soul, because it can be quite uncomfortable. But for Merton, he sees this as the path of the life of faith. It's part of what faith is that leads to the contemplative life. So this is the first step. This is not the end step at all for Merton. This is the first that will lead you into. And I guess for him, the contemplative life then is living in that sense of being awakened to the knowledge and the trust of God in mystery. So one of the essential aspects of this this reliance for Merton, this reliance of God for Merton is actually a kind of freedom it gives, because faith then is seen as that which frees us from the exhausting need to always keep justifying ourselves, you know, always finding a reason to sort of go, no, 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 it was fine, it was fine, it was that person over there, you know. So we don't have to do that anymore because actually, our value doesn't come from ourselves or whether we're doing right or wrong or what position we're holding, but it comes from God. Then we don't have to any longer spend our lives proving to ourselves and to other people that we actually matter. Gosh, that sounds amazing to me. So, as a result, faith is a kind of bursts the bubble of competition with other people because it makes us realize that we all bear the image of God and that there's this kind of deep solidarity with other people expressed through love and compassion for one another. We don't have to compete at all with one another. And again, I think that's enormously liberating because our world is so set up, if I don't get the job, they'll get the job. So what if they got the haven't got because I really wanted this job? It's all that, it's sort of, our society seems to be set up for us to compete. And so it's not really surprising, as Thomas Merton would say, that pretty much our lives quickly can be reduced to this form of hate. We hate other people, we hate ourselves, and this kind of, formation of a hell within ourselves when we've isolated ourselves, all because of this need to kind of justify, that we do matter, I do matter. So it's a really interesting take on the contemplative life. And it's a really interesting take on faith. The idea that faith then draws us closer to each other, whereas it's hate that drives us away and traps us in a hell of isolation of our own making. I think this is an amazing vision for a community of faith. And it may be something, to take back to your Christian communities and say, so in what ways do we rejoice in our faith with each other in solidarity? And in what ways do we try to describe our faith as doctrines and then say, well, you should believe what I believe, or why don't you believe what I believe? And I don't believe what you believe. Because Merton's saying that we've got the idea of faith wrong there. So for Merton, faith is not about an escape from reality, but it's actually an awakening to reality, which requires us to surrender. It requires humility, and it requires silence. Thomas believed that modern society really encouraged a kind of superficial living, and we still have that today. Where there's constant noise which makes it really difficult to encounter ourselves. And social media is actually exacerbating this, I think. Faith, in his view, it needs silence. It needs us to shut up. And maybe that's a good thing for me. Shut up, Emma. But it does need that silence. It needs that silence to start to understand what's going on within us, but also to start to understand how we're not in control, how to listen to God. But he says that this silence, it's not just an external silence, it's also an internal silence. So for him, silence is not just about a form of prayer or just isolated for contemplatives. It's actually a fundamental part of our faith. For Thomas Merton, it's a real key part. of faith to have silence. It's only in silence, that we begin to recognize we are not self-centered. We're not self-created. We're dependent beings. And for Merton, this recognition is not one that's humiliating, but it's liberating. So if we wanted to try and summarize in the last 2 minutes, if we wanted to try and summarize Thomas Merton's vision of faith in the Seeds of Contemplation, then we could say that firstly, faith is not certainty about God, it is trust in God. Secondly, it's the courage to live without total control. Thirdly, it's the willingness to enter into mystery, to go up into the cloud with Moses. Fourthly, it's the discovery that our deepest identity is found not in our ego, but in divine love. And finally, it's the realization that contemplation must flower into compassion and love for other people. So for Merton, faith is not an escape from the ordinary life. It actually begins a transformation of how we live ordinary life, how we see ourselves, each other, and the world itself. And of course, this is still so relevant for us today. And so often people are turned off by the church, and because actually what they're saying is, I don't know what they're saying actually, but maybe this understanding of what faith is and how remarkable it is and how precious it is and how it really changes you is what we need to start sharing with other people. So that's why in the questions I've said, give yourself some time to tell each other your faith stories, because I think Merton would say that, faith is not about, propositions. It's about lived experience. And all of us here, in some sense, have a different lived experience. So what is faith for you? And I think that Merton reminds us that the deepest truths are not going to be found in conquest or in certainty or in celebrity, but it's through silence, through humility and trust, and therefore leads us out of this kind of hell of hate to actually experience today what is the fullness of life which Christ came to bring.